What's up, guys? Matthew here. Today we are breaking Son, the most insane mountain deaths ever recorded. From a Karen who attacked the Sherpa trying to help her, to a logistics runner caught in a sudden whiteout and never making it back. It was May 17th, 2016, and the pre-dawn cold at Camp 3 on the Lhotse face held at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp clung to a narrow shelf chopped into the ice at 23,500 feet. Tents anchored by screws driven into blue ice that creaked under thermal stress. Stacy Lusk was 44, from Scottsdale, Arizona, a real estate executive with a legitimate climbing resume. Denali, Aconcagua, multiple Himalayan trekking peaks. She had planned to climb Everest, but missed the permit deadline and lost her guiding slot. She took a discounted Lhotse position instead, accepted on paper, never intended to climb Lhotse. Her climbing Sherpa was Pemba Chotar, 33, with 7 Lhotse summits and 4 on Everest. Small in stature, but his endurance at altitude was something bigger climbers couldn't match. Throughout the expedition, Stacy kept asking detailed questions about the Everest route, where it split from Lhotse, how the ropes were set up above Camp 3, what the traverse across the yellow band looked like. Pemba figured she was just curious. Other Sherpas later called it reconnaissance. I'll be real, when I was putting this story together, the reconnaissance part caught me off guard. This wasn't impulsive. She spent weeks gathering intel on a route she was never supposed to be on. On Summit Push morning, team climbed above Camp 3 in the dark, at around 24,500 feet, where the Lhotse route continued straight, while the Everest route cut left toward the Geneva Spur. Stacy unclipped from the Lhotse line and clipped onto the Everest traverse rope. Pemba called out right away. She waved him off and kept moving. He followed and told her straight. Her permit was for Lhotse. She had no oxygen cached on the Everest route. No Sherpa support above this point. She'd be arrested on descent. Stacy told him the permit system was a money grab, and she was already past the point of turning back. She called it a money grab. I need you to sit with that. The permit system exists because people die on this mountain every single year, and the woman calling it a scam is about to prove exactly why it exists. Pemba radioed base camp. Every response said the same thing: get her off the route. He blocked the fixed rope at the yellow band and laid out the math. Her oxygen was calculated for a Lhotse summit, not the extra hours Everest would take. Without supply cached above, she'd run out. Stacy pushed past him. Pemba refused to follow. He unclipped from the Everest rope and went back down to the Lhotse line. Stacy was alone on the Everest route, above 25,000 feet. She made it to around 26,200 feet on the Geneva Spur before the oxygen math became undeniable. She turned around, but she'd been above 24,500 feet for hours longer than planned, exhausted, hypoxic, moving through terrain she'd never seen before. On the traverse back, she missed a clip-in point on an exposed section of rope. She tumbled several hundred feet down the face before coming to rest against broken ice. A Sherpa team found her the next morning. Pemba Chotar was questioned by authorities for 2 days. His answers never changed. He warned her, blocked her, radioed for support, and refused to enable the decision. He was cleared, but other Sherpas said he was quieter after that season. 2 days of questioning for a man who did everything right. That part genuinely made me angry. He warned her, he blocked the rope, he called it in, and he still had to sit in a room and justify himself. In places like Everest Base Camp, things can look calm at first, but that doesn't last long. The weather, the ice, and even the ground itself can shift in ways that change everything fast, and people there have to adjust to that constantly. Everest Base Camp in Nepal sits at about 17,600 feet, where the air already feels thin and simple movement takes more effort, and just above it the Khumbu Icefall starts, a broken and unstable path of ice leading toward Camp 1, full of hidden cracks, moving blocks of ice, and ladder crossings that get rebuilt every season. What happened to Keanu Biombo on April 3rd, 2015 began as what was supposed to be a normal filming day in that area. The 38-year-old was a documentary filmmaker from Montana who filmed dangerous places without actually being part of the activity. He didn't have climbing training or mountaineering experience, but he had spent years around extreme sports crews, trying to capture high-risk situations while staying safely on the outside of them. In 2015, he came to Nepal to document the Sherpa workforce behind Everest expeditions, specifically the icefall doctors responsible for building and maintaining the route. His plan was to operate mainly from base camp, with limited movement into lower sections of the mountain, strictly for filming. After several days at base camp, early altitude effects began to appear, including headaches, poor sleep, and reduced appetite. These are common during acclimatization at this elevation, but he did not report them to medical staff, concerned it might restrict his access to icefall operations, central to his filming. His movements were not fully integrated into expedition tracking systems, and although he carried a personal locator beacon capable of sending satellite emergency coordinates, it was not registered in the expedition network, meaning any activation would appear as an unidentified signal. On the morning he entered the icefall, he left base camp early to film routine route maintenance by the icefall doctors, moving alone with 2 cameras, a tripod, and the beacon. The Khumbu Icefall is among Everest's most dangerous zones, not due to technical climbing difficulty, but because of constant structural change. Crevasses open without warning, seracs collapse under shifting stress, and the entire route is rebuilt each season, while remaining inherently unstable. His footage shows controlled, deliberate movement through the lower icefall, with frequent stops that appear to reflect both altitude strain and equipment handling. He pauses often to steady his breathing and reposition his camera, suggesting sustained physiological load rather than acute distress. His posture remains stable, but his pace is slow and inconsistent, consistent with early hypoxia, combined with physical exertion and unstable terrain. Deeper into the icefall, he reached an area people on the mountain sometimes call the popcorn field because of the tight clusters of tall ice blocks packed together across the glacier. From the surface, it can look solid enough to stand on in places, so he set up his tripod there and started filming a nearby ice formation. But what isn't obvious in that kind of terrain is that the surface can be misleading. It may look firm while the ice underneath is slowly shifting and breaking along old stress lines built up over time, not something you can see just by looking at it. For several minutes, the camera remains steady as he films the serac. Then a low cracking sound is captured on audio, consistent with internal glacial stress rather than surface collapse. The serac shifts slightly, only a few feet, but the movement transfers force into surrounding ice. The platform he is standing on, though appearing solid, sits directly over a pre-existing fracture line, likely formed by long-term glacial compression. Within seconds, that fracture activates. The ice beneath him gives way without warning, dropping into a concealed crevasse. The collapse is not a surface break, but a structural failure along an internal stress boundary. He falls with the platform as it separates from the surrounding ice. The crevasse is narrow at the surface, but constricts quickly with depth. He comes to rest in a vertical position, wedged tightly between opposing ice walls. Movement becomes severely restricted almost immediately, with limited ability to expand his chest or reposition his limbs. His personal locator beacon activated shortly after impact, transmitting GPS coordinates, but it first appeared as an unidentified signal because it was not registered in the expedition system. A report from an icefall doctor in the same sector helped confirm the location, and a rescue team was deployed into the icefall, navigating unstable ice and fixed rope sections to reach him. Extraction required mechanical hauling due to depth and narrowing crevasse walls, but worsening structural instability caused a secondary ice shift during recovery operations. Contact was lost shortly after the initial haul began, and no visual confirmation of his position could be re-established. The icefall sector collapsed further during the following days, sealing the crevasse system and preventing any recovery attempt. Keanu Biombo was officially declared missing, and the site remained inaccessible for the next decade. In 2026, glacial retreat in the Khumbu Icefall exposed a previously sealed crevasse system. Within it, researchers recovered a preserved body alongside a chest-mounted camera containing intact footage of his final descent and collapse. In the Khumbu region, after the monsoon, the glacier doesn't really settle. It looks solid on the surface, but beneath it the ice is still moving, melting, and forming hidden, empty pockets that can collapse without warning. It was March 12th, 2026, and another summit window had arrived. The strongest forecast of the season, but also possibly the last. Every team that had not yet summited was going. Marcus Hale was a British guide in his early 40s, 11 Himalayan expedition, 5 Everest summits, 3 clients, 2 Sherpas, Lakpa Dendi, mid-30s with 5 summits, and Pasang Tendu, late 20s with 3. On the South Col, Marcus counted over 130 climbers, preparing to depart within the same 2-hour window. He radioed his operator about the congestion. He was told to proceed, The team departed at midnight. The line stretched from the col to the balcony without a gap, and at approximately 27,800 feet, the line stopped completely, something that I could see coming again. A climber from a budget expedition had collapsed on the fixed rope, unconscious, clipped in, blocking the only route. Moving him required unclipping his safety line on terrain where an unsecured body would slide thousands of feet. Over 30 climbers stacked below, motionless in the death zone, oxygen ticking downward. And thinking about it, the stories I'm covering are only the confirmed ones I found while researching. Imagine the amount of equally horrifying and brutal tragedies lost to the mountain we'll never know about. 30 minutes stuck, and then an hour, and then 90 minutes. And it might seem cruel, but the collapsed climber was finally moved to the side. He died there, and the line resumed past his body. This was simply how things go in situations like this, and I get it. 90 minutes at 27,500 feet had consumed the oxygen dozens needed for descent. Marcus made the call, turn around. 2 of 3 clients refused. One was on his 3rd Everest attempt. The other had promised her family. Marcus descended with the 3rd client and both Sherpas. The 2 remaining clients continued. Both summited late, and neither returned. According to what I found, other climbers saw the first client fell on the traverse below the south summit, missed a step and slid off the fixed rope. The second became disoriented in whiteout and wandered off-route, found dead the next day, several hundred feet from the fixed lines. The budget expedition lost 2 as well. The collapsed climber, plus another client who ran out of oxygen during the standstill. 4 dead from a single push. Marcus later called it the worst night of his career, and I definitely agree. But stay with me. There's another climb far worse that I think truly showcases how bad the situation on Everest has become. It was May 14th, 2015, and Everest's Camp 4 sat at 26,000 feet on the South Col, a windswept saddle of rock and ice where temperatures hovered near minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, even in afternoon sun. Tents clung to exposed terrain, anchored with buried gear and prayer that wind wouldn't strengthen beyond what nylon could withstand. Derek Hoffman, 39, from Boulder, Colorado, had summited 6 of the 7 summits and spent 18 months training specifically for Everest. He had paid $68,000 to join a commercial expedition and brought along Paul Reeves, 37, from Manchester, a climbing partner he had known for 8 years. Both men were experienced and motivated by the same goal. What Derek hadn't mentioned was that summiting first between them mattered more than their friendship. Tsultrim Norbu, 42, from the Khumbu Valley, was Derek's assigned Sherpa guide with 12 Everest summits over a 15-year career. His income supported a household of 7, including his mother's medical expenses after a stroke. During the afternoon rest period, Derek noticed Paul's oxygen cache contained 3 full bottles and 1 partial, while his held 2 full and 2 partials due to a packing error. The difference meant Paul would have slightly more oxygen during the summit push, potentially allowing him to climb faster. Derek made his decision while Paul slept. He swapped 2 of Paul's full bottles for his own partials and returned without anyone noticing. The bottles were identical, same manufacturer, same faded labeling from weeks of handling at altitude. The summit push began at 11 p.m. under clear skies. In the rush of final preparation, headlamps, regulators, harnesses checked in the dark, Paul grabbed his first bottle and threaded the regulator without examining the gauge. At Camp 4, where oxygen-starved brains prioritized sequence over scrutiny, verifying gauges with numb fingers was the kind of task that got skipped when the team was already moving. Derek, Paul, and Tsultrim climbed together toward the balcony at 27,600 feet. Paul moved slightly ahead, his pace strong. Derek followed, conserving energy. Around 3:30 a.m., at approximately 27,800 feet, Paul's regulator began delivering inconsistent flow. He checked the gauge and discovered his first bottle was nearly empty. He switched to his second and continued, assuming the first had leaked. By the south summit at 28,700 feet, his second bottle was also running low. The realization arrived with altitude-sharpened clarity. Both bottles had been partials. He turned to look at Derek, who climbed steadily behind him with no oxygen concerns. and understood immediately. Sultrim checked Paul's remaining oxygen, saw perhaps 90 minutes of supply, and recognized that continuing would leave Paul without oxygen for the entire descent. He told Paul they needed to turn around. Paul descended from the south summit with Sultrim accompanying him, while Derek continued upward toward the summit. The descent on limited oxygen was brutal. Paul's coordination deteriorated rapidly, his hands losing sensation as blood flow prioritized his core. Sultrim shared his own oxygen intermittently, but the sharing meant both men were functioning in zones where their bodies were actively dying. At the balcony, Paul collapsed. His breathing had become shallow, each exhale carrying a wet rattle that Sultrim recognized as fluid building in the lungs. Sultrim radioed for emergency support, and 2 Sherpas climbed up from Camp 4. The descent required 3 hours of careful lowering, with Sultrim managing rope work while fighting his own oxygen deprivation. During one transition, he wrenched his shoulder badly, catching Paul's full weight after a stumble, the joint tearing in ways that would require surgery. They reached Camp 4 just after noon. Paul was placed in a tent with oxygen flowing at maximum rate, but his condition continued to deteriorate. His lips had turned gray, his responses fading to murmurs. The oxygen deprivation above the south summit had triggered high-altitude pulmonary edema that was filling his lungs faster than supplemental flow could compensate. The damage had been accumulating for hours, and the body had passed the point where intervention at 26,000 feet could reverse the spiral. Paul Reeves died at Camp 4 at approximately 4:30 p.m. on May 15, 2015. He was 37 years old. His lungs had filled with fluid that altitude and exhaustion had made inevitable the moment his oxygen ran short above 28,000 feet. Derek summited at 6:15 a.m. and descended without incident. When he returned to Camp 4 that afternoon, Paul's body had already been covered. The confrontation that followed was witnessed by multiple climbers. Derek claimed he had made a mistake during gear checks. No one believed him. Sultrim's shoulder injury required reconstructive surgery that cost more than his expedition earnings and left him with permanent reduced range of motion. He retired from high-altitude guiding. Derek was quietly banned from future Nepali permits and never returned to the Himalayas. Nobody planned for Graham Ashworth and Renzo Marchetti to be on Everest at the same time. They'd co-founded an investment fund 7 years earlier, and the partnership had burned down in a lawsuit that took 2 years to settle. Unsurprisingly, they hadn't spoken since. Graham was 51, British, hedge fund money. His son Callum was 19, a rugby player with Kilimanjaro and Mont Blanc under his belt. Renzo was 49, Italian-American, private equity. His son Nico was 20 and, unlike him, actually knew what he was doing on mountains. His resume consisted of Aconcagua, Denali, technical routes in the Dolomites. Both fathers had booked the same expedition company for the spring 2017 season without knowing the other was on the list. They found out on the same afternoon at base camp. The politeness was surgical. No scenes, no confrontations. Just 2 men who couldn't be in the same mess tent without the temperature dropping. Other climbers on the expedition later said Graham would physically reposition himself in the dining tent if Renzo sat within 3 seats of him, and Renzo started timing his meals to avoid overlap. Their sons, who had no part in the business fallout, ended up getting along during acclimatization rotations. That made both fathers visibly uncomfortable. Kancha Bode, 36, got assigned to the Ashworths. 6 summits under his belt, quiet by nature, but sharp enough to read a room. He figured out the rivalry before anyone even told him about it. During the second rotation to Camp 2, Graham pushed his pace hard enough that climbers way behind him could hear him gasping for air, and the only reason was because Renzo's team had left like 20 minutes earlier. I've talked about ego-driven climbs a lot on this channel, but when you have 2 egos feeding off each other, it's a whole different situation. They weren't climbing against the mountain anymore, they were climbing against each other, and neither one of them was ever going to be the first to stop. Summit push, May 21st. Both families in the same line going up from the South Col. Traffic on the fixed ropes slowed everyone down, climbers bunching up at narrow sections. Graham watching Renzo's headlamp above, Renzo refusing to slow down, knowing Graham was below. 2 turnaround times, both held hostage by the other man's position. The split happened at the south summit, 28,700 feet. Nico stepped into his father's path and wouldn't move. No yelling. He just planted himself and made it physical. Renzo pushed back, gestured at the summit, and eventually gave in. They turned around. Nico saved both their lives with a decision that took maybe 90 seconds max. Callum tried to do the same thing with Graham. It didn't work, not because he didn't mean it, but because the relationship was built differently. Nico had spent years climbing on his own terms and had the standing to override his father. Callum had always climbed on his father's schedule, with his father's money, at his father's direction. However, you can't expect to have that kind of power in a single conversation at 28,000 feet. That's what stayed with me. Callum tried. He saw what Nico did and he tried to copy it, but the foundation wasn't there. Graham and Callum summited at 2:15 p.m., well past turnaround. Then the weather started to turn. A jet stream shift arrived earlier than expected. The wind picked up first, then visibility started closing in over the next hour until the upper mountain was gone. Graham's HACE symptoms surfaced during the descent: confusion, stumbling, and inability to follow the fixed ropes right in front of him. Callum tried to guide him through it, but trying to navigate terrain you can barely see with a father who can't even think. A single thought is a problem that doesn't have an answer. They went off route somewhere above the south summit. Callum found a rock outcrop and got them both clipped to an abandoned fixed line from a previous season. It blocked enough wind to make the difference between dying in the first hour and lasting until dawn. He still had some oxygen left in his bottle, running at a low flow, and that kept him on the right side of conscious. Survival rates for an unplanned bivouac above 8,000 meters are almost non-existent. The fact that Callum had even partial oxygen and a windbreak is likely the only reason he was still breathing when they found him. He spent the night going in and out, forcing himself awake each time to talk to his father. Graham answered at first. The answers got less coherent as the hours went on. Around 3 in the morning, they stopped altogether. Graham's breathing went uneven, then shallow, then quiet. A Sherpa team found Callum the next morning, still clipped in next to his father. Conscious but wrecked. He survived. He lost both feet below the ankle. Kanchabode had been feeling tightness in his chest since the summit push, but pushed through during the rescue coordination until his breathing deteriorated badly. HAPE. He was flown to Kathmandu. He recovered from the fluid in his lungs, but the panic attacks that followed didn't go away. He quit guiding and took a job running a lodge in the Khumbu. It was July 14th, 2015, and the wind at Camp 4 on K2's Abruzzi Spur had been building since noon. The shoulder sat at roughly 25,000 feet, a tilted shelf of compacted snow where tents huddled in shallow depressions scraped out by ice axes. Above camp, the bottleneck couloir rose toward the summit, a steep gully running directly beneath a hanging serac the size of an office building that could release without warning. At 28,251 feet, K2's summit was over 3,000 vertical feet overhead, and the mountain was telling anyone who would listen the weather was turning. Among those not listening was Laurent Beaumont, a 44-year-old from Lyon, France. Laurent had sold a logistics software company in his late 30s, funding a second career as an adventure athlete. He had summited Broad Peak and Gasherbrum too over the previous 2 seasons, both guided, where Sherpa teams managed logistics while Laurent managed the narrative. Others on K2 that season described him as a client who tipped well and listened poorly, and having gone through dozens of these stories by now, I can tell you that combination is one of the most dangerous things you can bring to the world's highest peak. The expedition's meteorologist had issued an updated forecast that afternoon. The stable window would collapse roughly 12 hours earlier than predicted. Wind above 26,000 feet would exceed 50 miles per hour by late morning on the 15th, with visibility dropping to near zero. The message was clear. Any summit attempt needed to launch by 9 that evening. Kilupemba, Laurent's lead Sherpa, relayed the forecast with a recommendation to wait. Another window was expected in 4 to 5 days. Kilu was 41, with 6 summits above 26,000 feet, including 2 on K2. He had the quiet authority that most clients respected instinctively. Laurent was not most clients. He argued his body was deteriorating, that other teams were launching tonight, and that he would not be left behind. Kilu repeated his concern. The margin was too thin. Laurent responded that he had paid for a summit attempt and expected support. That line, "I paid for a summit attempt," came up over and over when I was piecing this together, and every time it ended the same way. They departed Camp 4 at 9:45 p.m. Laurent moved steadily but slowly, his pace roughly 20% behind schedule. They cleared the bottleneck at approximately 3:30 a.m. and continued to the traverse above, reaching 27,200 feet by 4 a.m. The lightening sky revealed clouds building rapidly along the western horizon. Qilu assessed, at least 4 hours to the summit, the storm arriving in roughly 6. No margin for descent. Qilu told Laurent to turn around. Laurent refused. He could see the summit pyramid, close enough to feel inevitable. 3 climbers from other expeditions had already turned back. Laurent watched them go and interpreted their retreat as weakness. They continued. By 6:30 a.m., visibility had dropped to 200 feet. Wind gusted hard enough to require bracing on the fixed rope. Snow fell horizontally. At 7:15, Qilu stopped and communicated that they were descending immediately. Laurent argued briefly, but the wind had grown strong enough that even his compromised judgment recognized continuing was impossible. The descent through the whiteout was disorienting. Fixed ropes provided a physical guide, but blowing snow erased every visual reference. At approximately 8:40 a.m., Laurent unclipped to adjust his iced-over oxygen mask. His stiff gloves made the procedure slow. When he looked up, the rope had vanished in the whiteout. Qilu, moving ahead with his head down, did not immediately realize Laurent had stopped. Qilu turned back at the next anchor point and found no tension on the rope. He retraced his steps, shouting into wind that carried nothing. He searched for over 40 minutes, traversing back and forth across the slope in conditions threatening his own survival. His fingers burned with cold even inside expedition gloves. He radioed base camp, and the response confirmed what he already knew. No rescue was possible until the storm passed. I keep circling back to those 40 minutes. Qilu searching blind, in a storm for a man who put them both there, knowing every extra minute was costing him something he wouldn't get back. Laurent Beaumont was found 2 days later, approximately 300 feet below the traverse, lying in a position suggesting he had wandered off route. His oxygen mask was partially removed. He was 44 years old. Qilu Pemba was evacuated with severe frostbite on both hands from the extended search. He lost 3 fingers during surgery in Skardu. The damage ended his career. He returned to Solukhumbu and took work managing a trekking lodge. When asked about K2, he said nothing that anyone repeated. The pattern is familiar. A warning delivered clearly, rejected confidently, and proven right at a cost that can never be recovered. But on K2, that pattern repeats, and the people who suffer most are rarely the ones who made the decision. It was May 8th, 2017, and Everest Base Camp was bright and still, the sun softening the glacier into a wet sheen. The temperature hit 31 degrees Fahrenheit, mild enough to make the mountain feel almost welcoming. Andrea Farr was 47, from Miami, a hedge fund manager who solved problems with capital. Mountains, she was finding out, didn't respond to money. Her body needed weeks to adapt to altitude, and no wire transfer could speed that up. She had done 1 rotation to Camp 1, which wiped her out more than expected. The schedule called for 2 more over 10 days. Andrea saw dead time. The arrangement went through a helicopter company in Kathmandu. Fake a knee injury, get evacuated, have the helicopter land at Camp 2 instead of flying to Kathmandu. She iced and compressed her knee overnight to create swelling. The expedition doctor found inflammation that looked like a soft tissue injury and called for evacuation. I've covered a lot of shortcuts people take on this mountain, but this one is something else. You can buy your way past a lot of things in life, but you cannot buy your way past biology. Red blood cells don't care how much money you have. The helicopter lifted off from base camp and instead of heading to Kathmandu, set down at Camp 2 on the western CWM. Cash to intermediaries ensured the flight log listed a weather diversion near Farich. Andrea stepped onto the glacier at 21,000 feet with a body that had spent 1 night above 19,000. Her blood hadn't adapted, her lungs hadn't adjusted, her brain hadn't recalibrated. Every system still thought it was at sea level. Sonam Rinjing, 31, her assigned climbing Sherpa with 6 summits, came up with a regular rotation the next day and found Andrea already in her tent. The knee looked fine. Sonam checked with base camp, confirmed the story, and reported what he saw. This woman had not acclimatized. Taking her higher was a medical risk. Andrea waved it off and reminded everyone what she'd paid. They let her try for Camp 3 with close monitoring. At 22,500 feet, altitude her body had 0 adaptation for, she got hit with a crushing headache. Her coordination fell apart. Her crampon placements were sloppy. Sonam watched her responses come slower, watched her eyes glaze over, watched acute mountain sickness speed toward something worse. Sonam told her to go down. Andrea refused. She made it to 23,000 feet before she couldn't clip her own ascender without someone guiding her hands. Her words were garbled. She kept fumbling gears she'd used for weeks. Full haze, severe cerebral edema shutting her brain down. Sonam and a second Sherpa started lowering her down the Lhotse face. Andrea turned combative, her dying brain reading rescue as an attack. She swung her arms, fighting them. And here's the thing that wrecks me about HACE. The person you're saving fights you. They don't understand you're helping. Their brain turns rescue into threat, and Sonam is absorbing punches on steep ice, trying to keep this woman alive. Her ice axe caught Sonam in the shoulder. In the same moment, Andrea unclipped her own harness. She slid right away on the steep ice and fell roughly 800 feet before hitting a rock shelf. The injuries were catastrophic. 800 feet. That's roughly the height of a 60-story building, and the only reason it stopped there was because the rock shelf caught her. Without it, the Lhotse face doesn't end for another 2,000 feet. Sonam Rinjing needed surgery in Kathmandu, torn ligaments that never fully healed. He couldn't go back to high-altitude guiding. He ended up doing trekking work in the lower Khumbu at about half the pay, supporting a wife, 2 kids, aging parents, and a younger brother still in school. Half the income, because a woman from Miami couldn't sit still for 10 days. I don't know how you process that math. Real quick, if you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly invested in these stories. And that's exactly who this channel is for. A like or a subscribe tells the algorithm to keep pushing this kind of content. Alright, back to the mountain. Forts in the Khumbu sits at 12,467 feet, where thin air is part of daily life and movement. Through the village is shaped by the steady flow of Everest expeditions. On May 14, 2016, 24-year-old Junior Porter, working for a Namche Bazaar logistics company, was assigned to a commercial climbing supply run. He had a few seasons of experience and had reached Camp 2 before, but anything beyond that was still unfamiliar territory. The Lhotse face had long been considered one of Everest's most dangerous corridors, not because of technical difficulty, but because of what sustained exposure does to the human body and equipment at extreme altitude. Thousands had passed through over the decades, and not all returned. The 2026 Glacial Survey started as a science project. A team from Kathmandu University and a European climate group had been studying ice loss on Everest's southern routes since 2023. But by late March 2026, what they were finding on the mountain changed the entire focus of the work. The first body appeared at roughly 24,800 feet, partly exposed from a retreating ice shelf near the base of the Yellow Band. It was still in a harness, clipped to a fixed rope now hanging loose from a melted anchor. Forensic estimates placed the death between 15 and 25 years earlier. Within 2 weeks, the survey became a recovery operation. One of the recovered was a young porter whose identity took weeks to confirm. He was found on a narrow ledge at the Yellow Band, still in his harness, a load frame frozen beneath the ice. An oxygen regulator remained attached. Its serial number matched a batch recalled in 2016 for valve seal failure in extreme cold. But when investigators examined what was still attached to him, they realized something wasn't normal about how he died. The answer wasn't obvious at first, and it pointed to a failure that should never have happened at that altitude. His name was Dawa Tamang. He had last been seen on the mountain on May 14, 2016, during a supply run that was never completed. That season, Dawa was asked to take over a supply run up to Camp 4 after another porter got sick at Camp 3 and had to turn back. The pay was 3 times what he usually earned, and at home his family was still paying off a loan from the 2015 earthquake, so he said yes. He had no medical training for high altitude. He was given one oxygen tank meant to last about 6 hours. The equipment came from shared supplies, marked as fine, but the oxygen regulator wasn't pressure tested before he used it. Conditions on May 14th were considered stable by forecast. Temperatures at Camp 3 sat near minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds around 18 miles per hour, increasing with altitude. Dawa climbed with Mingma and Pasang, each carrying roughly 44 pounds of expedition supplies. They moved in single file up fixed ropes across the Lhotse face, a 50-degree wall of glacial ice where progress depends entirely on anchored lines. A known weak section near the yellow band had been flagged by rope fixers, but never reached the logistics teams. The ice there held under testing, but carried little margin for sudden load. As they reached it, the wind increased. Mingma climbed first, then Pasang. Dawa followed. His oxygen regulator broke because a cracked seal let moisture in. It froze and slowly blocked the flow until almost no oxygen was coming through. There was no warning that anything had failed. Above 25,000 feet, oxygen loss leads to rapid cognitive decline before obvious physical collapse. Pasang saw Dawa stopped and assumed he was resting. Moments later, Dawa unclipped from the rope. The reason was never confirmed. Investigators considered disorientation and hypoxia. Oxygen deprivation likely began 10 minutes earlier. He was already impaired. He fell, sliding hundreds of feet before a crampon caught rock on a shallow ice shelf, stopping his descent but leaving him critically injured and pinned on a narrow ledge below the yellow band. Rescue teams reached his last known position after radio contact from above, but worsening weather and unstable terrain prevented any sustained access. Visibility collapsed within hours, and no physical recovery could be completed before operations were suspended. Dawa was declared missing that same day after contact was lost, with no recovery possible under the conditions. The case was recorded as an unrecovered fatality on the Lhasa face, and no confirmed retrieval was made in 2016 or in the seasons that followed. In 2026, retreating ice near the yellow band exposed a harnessed body anchored to a partially collapsed fixed line system. Identification confirmed Dawa Tamang through recovered equipment and expedition records, marking the first successful recovery since his disappearance in 2016. Some had never been formally reported missing. The mountain had kept its own record. Glacial retreat is expected to continue exposing remains through the 2030s. The 2026 recoveries, part of several dozen documented cases, marked not an end, but a beginning. For families in Khumbu villages, the discoveries brought closure and renewed grief. Some had waited years without answers. Dawa's family learned in April 2026 that he had finally been found. It was March 6th, 2026, and the second summit window had opened, and the traffic was even worse here. Among the climbers departing Camp 4 that night were Ryan and Kara Mercer, both 32, married, from Denver. She ran ultramarathons. He had been a collegiate swimmer. They had trained for 2 years and treated Everest as a shared milestone, worth the $90,000 they had spent between them. Their fitness exceeded most clients on the mountain, but neither had been above 23,500 feet before Camp 4, and Everest above the South Col was a different world. Their Sherpa was Chongba Rinji, late 30s, 6 Everest summits, known for his directness with clients who didn't want to hear what he had to say, something most Sherpas should be doing honestly, with how stupid some of the climbers I've covered can be. He had seen the departing traffic, over 100 climbers from multiple expeditions, leaving within the same 2-hour window, and radioed his concern. He was told to proceed anyways. The couple climbed well through the darkness. The problems began above the south summit, at roughly 28,500 feet, where the route funneled toward the Hillary Step, where, like in the other stories I've covered, the line had stopped entirely again. Climbers ascending and descending on the same fixed rope had created gridlock on a ridge narrow enough that a stumble meant a fall of thousands of feet. Now, if you weren't already scared with how fatal bottlenecks and overcrowding can be, you haven't even seen half of it. Stay with me. It's going to get worse from here on. They stood in that line for nearly 2 hours. Oxygen burned steadily. Wind drove across the exposed ridge. Chongba monitored the gauges and told them directly they would need to turn around now or they would not have enough oxygen to descend safely. Ryan agreed, but Kara was not in the same boat. Over $90,000 combined. 2 years of training. She could see the summit. She was not turning around, but Ryan would not leave without her. And so they pushed on together, and my heart breaks for Ryan. He clearly sensed something was wrong, and going any further would be dangerous, yet he could not leave the love of his life alone. They summited in the early afternoon, far later than any safe schedule allowed. On descent, Kara's coordination began failing above the south summit. Steps became uneven, her responses delayed by seconds that stretched longer as hypoxia deepened. Ryan stayed beside her, matching her pace, refusing to descend faster. Chongba split his own oxygen supply to keep her conscious. Night fell. They were still above 27,000 feet. The temperature dropped. The wind increased. Kara's movements suddenly became mechanical, then stopped entirely. Chongba attempted to revive her, adjusting oxygen, speaking through the mask, but she did not respond. She died on the fixed ropes after dark, with her husband beside her. Ryan Mercer and Chongba Rinji reached Camp 4 at dawn. Ryan's hands were destroyed, severe frostbite that later cost him 3 fingers. But what tore at my soul even more was that he had to descend, leaving behind his beloved wife all alone, cold and dead. Chongba, who had spent over 20 hours above 27,000 feet, suffered frostbite to both feet, requiring a partial amputation of several toes. At 38, his guiding career was over, ended not by his own mistake, but by a system that sent too many people into a space too small to hold them. 2 summit windows, 2 disasters, both produced by the same conditions. Too many climbers, too little room, and decisions made under pressure that would never survive scrutiny at sea level. But those cases involved people who at least understood the risks. The next case would show what happened when someone with almost no experience was pushed into the death zone by a system that valued his money more than his life. It was September 28, 2014, and Manaslu's Camp 3 sat at 23,500 feet on a snow platform, carved into the steep face, tents buffeted by wind that had been building since midday. Above camp, the route continued toward Camp 4 and the summit pyramid, another 3,000 vertical feet of technical climbing through terrain where weather determined their survival more than skill. Craig Hollis, 43, from Denver, and his climbing partner Elena Rossi, 29, from Milan, had met 2 years earlier on Cho Oyu and discovered they shared the same appetite for 8,000-meter peaks. Craig had summited 3 of the 14 8,000ers, Elena too, and both had committed to climbing the remaining peaks together. What Elena didn't know was that Craig had been quietly competing with her since the beginning. She was younger, fitter, and acclimatized faster. On Makalu the year before, she had reached the summit 45 minutes ahead of him, a gap Craig treated as a humiliation he never mentioned but never forgot. Nima Gyalgen, 35, from the Rawling Valley, was the expedition's lead Sherpa with 9 climbs above 8,000 meters. He had survived an avalanche on Dhaulagiri in 2011 by recognizing fracture lines forming across the slope before the slab released. That instinct for reading conditions had defined his reputation ever since. On the afternoon of September 28th, Nima reviewed weather data and brought concerns to the expedition leader. The jet stream was dipping south faster than predicted, with winds forecast to exceed 60 miles per hour by the following evening. The summit push was postponed. Craig received the news with visible frustration. That evening, he approached Elena and proposed an alternative, a fast, alpine-style push the next morning, just the 2 of them. He showed her the same forecast data Nima had reviewed, but framed it differently, emphasizing 12 hours of manageable wind before conditions deteriorated rather than the storm system closing behind it. Fast climbers could summit and return before the window closed. Elena hesitated. She trusted Sherpa judgment more than Craig's interpretation, but Craig pressed with a confidence that made caution feel like timidity. Their partnership was built on pushing limits together. She agreed. They departed Camp 3 at 2 a.m. on September 29th without informing anyone, carrying minimal gear, 1 oxygen bottle each, a single rope, and no bivouac equipment. The climb went well for the first 5 hours. They bypassed Camp 4, moving on to the summit plateau where altitude pressed down like a physical weight. Elena moved ahead, her pace noticeably stronger. By 25,500 feet, Craig was falling behind, 40 yards, then 60, then 100. At approximately 11 a.m., still roughly 1,000 feet below the summit, the weather changed. Wind speeds jumped from 25 to 40 miles per hour within minutes, driving spindrift that reduced visibility to arm's length. The window Craig had promised was slamming shut hours early. Elena told him they needed to descend immediately. Craig refused. His response revealed the calculation beneath the partnership. She could go down if she wanted, but he was continuing, and she would need to leave him the rope. The demand forced Elena into a choice: abandon her partner above 25,000 feet in a building storm without shared safety equipment, or stay. She stayed. They continued for 30 minutes before Craig's pace collapsed entirely. At 25,800 feet, he sat down and could not stand again. His legs had failed. Elena tried pulling him upright and felt the dead weight of a body that had stopped cooperating. The storm was fully overhead, visibility near zero, wind gusts hitting 50 miles per hour. She radioed Camp 3 and reached Nima, who had discovered their departure hours earlier. He told her to begin descending immediately. Elena could not move Craig. She tried for 20 minutes. He was semi-conscious, his exposed skin waxy. His shivering stopped, a sign his body had exhausted its ability to generate heat. Nima reached them at approximately 2:30 p.m. after climbing more than 2,000 vertical feet in deteriorating conditions, with one Sherpa and emergency oxygen. They got Craig onto supplemental flow, but his core temperature had dropped too far. Nima rigged a short rope system, and they began lowering him, while Elena descended ahead. During one steep section, Nima's anchor pulled loose and shock-loaded his back up, slamming him into the slope. His ankle buckled and snapped. He continued on the broken ankle, accepting that permanent damage was accumulating with every step. Craig Hollis stopped breathing at approximately 4:15 p.m. on September 29, 2014, at roughly 24,800 feet on Manaslu's upper face. He was 43 years old. Nima confirmed no pulse and made the decision to leave the body and focus on getting the remaining climbers down alive. The descent to Camp 3 took 6 more hours through whiteout conditions. Elena survived with frostbite requiring partial amputation of 2 fingertips. Nima's ankle fracture required 2 surgeries that left him with limited mobility and chronic pain. He retired from guiding and returned to farming in the Rawlwailing Valley. His career ended at 35. Investigation confirmed Craig had misrepresented weather data to convince Elena to join an unauthorized summit push. When Elena Keene was dying of ovarian cancer in a Boston hospital in late 2012, she asked her husband Douglas to scatter her ashes from the summit of Everest. Elena had never climbed anything. The request was about something bigger than a mountain. She wanted to exist at the highest point on Earth after her body couldn't carry her anywhere anymore. Douglas took that wish and turned it into a mission. He was 50, a pharmaceutical executive, and he had the resources to make it happen. He hired a coach, trained for over a year, and booked a spring 2014 expedition. Scattering ashes on Everest's summit is more common than most people think. Dozens of climbers have carried remains of loved ones to the top over the years, and some expedition companies even list it as a service option. He was going to carry Elena to the top of the world. But the bigger problem was that he also brought their daughter along. Fiona Keene was 21. She'd done Kilimanjaro on a guided trip and some trekking in the Alps. That was the extent of her experience with altitude. She wasn't on Everest because she wanted to be. She was there because saying no to her dead mother's wish felt like a second abandonment. Grief had made the unreasonable feel mandatory. I've turned that over in my head more times than I'd like to admit. A kid agreeing to do something terrifying because refusing feels like betraying a person who's already gone. There's no clean way out of that. Saying yes is dangerous and saying no feels unforgivable. Lakpa Jangbu, 29, 4 summits, was assigned to Fiona. He saw what was happening right away. The forced smiles, the going through the motions compliance, the way she looked at the upper mountain like it was a debt collector. Notice how she was the only client on the expedition who never once took a photo above base camp. Everyone else was documenting everything. Fiona didn't even unzip her camera bag. He flagged it. Douglas thanked the expedition leader for the concern and said Fiona was just nervous. At Camp 2, Fiona told Lakpa she didn't want to go any higher. She was terrified and grieving and couldn't understand why her father didn't see that scattering ashes on a summit wouldn't bring her mother back. Lakpa passed this up the chain. Douglas sat with Fiona afterward, and other climbers saw the conversation, but couldn't hear it. She agreed to continue. They both made it to the South Col and launched for the summit on the night of May 18th. Fiona climbed in what Lakpa later described as autopilot, moving, clipping, following directions, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Lakpa stayed close enough to grab her if he needed to. Traffic above the south summit put about 40 minutes between them. Douglas got there first, scattered the ashes, and just kind of disappeared into the moment. By the time Fiona arrived, he didn't even notice how bad she was. Over 20 minutes on the summit before he realized something was wrong. The most human, most understandable delay in any of these 5 stories, and it'll be the most expensive. The descent went wrong at the Hillary Step, where the death zone was located. It was a place where oxygen was just so thin, even for elite climbers. Fiona clipped in wrong and slipped 6 feet before the rope caught her. Broken wrist and bruised ribs. Not life-threatening, but any injury at that altitude is basically a ticking time bomb. Lakpa splinted her wrist and started walking her down one careful step at a time. Progress measured in single digits of feet per minute. Douglas, descending behind them, had been above 27,000 feet for far too long. His breathing got worse over the next hour. Wet cough, then pink spit, then a gurgling quality to every breath. Pulmonary edema building in real time. He collapsed around 27,200 feet, still conscious for a few minutes, but unable to stand. Lakpa tried to get Douglas up, pulled his arm, braced against the slope. He couldn't stand. Lakpa stayed longer than he should have, but Fiona was still alive and moving, so he took her down to the South Col. Douglas stayed on the mountain with Elena. Fiona healed physically. Lakpa tried one more season the next year, but turned around at Camp 3 and couldn't go higher. He moved to Pokhara and started guiding treks on the Annapurna circuit. Pokhara sits at about 2,700 feet, right on Phua Lake, with views of the Annapurna Range across the water. It's where a lot of retired high-altitude workers end up, close enough to the mountains to still feel connected, but low enough that the air doesn't ask anything of you. Easier terrain and lower stakes. It was the kind of altitude where leaving someone behind isn't part of the job description. It was August 2nd, 2014, and Camp 3 on K2 sat at roughly 24,000 feet, anchored to a steep snow slope where the mountain briefly relented before rearing toward the shoulder. The tents were pitched on platforms chopped into hardpack, and the air was thin enough that experienced climbers paused between sentences to breathe. Elliot Marsh was 28, a freelance photographer from Bristol who had built a modest following documenting adventure sports. His mountaineering experience consisted of Mont Blanc, a guided island peak ascent, and an abandoned Denali attempt. K2 was a leap his experience did not justify, and several people had told him so. He had secured a spot with a Pakistani operator whose screening prioritized payment over qualification. When I came across the details of his application and matched it against what K2 actually demands, I genuinely could not understand how anyone signed off on it. His assigned Sherpa was Kancha Nuru, 33, from near Lukla, with 4 26,000-foot summits, including Kangchenjunga. Kancha was reserved, the kind of guide who watched more than he spoke, and formed assessments through observation. Within a week, he had identified Elliot as the weakest climber in the expedition, not in fitness, but in altitude tolerance. The signs appeared early. During the second acclimatization rotation at Camp 2, Elliot developed a persistent headache he attributed to dehydration. Kancha noted it. The headache persisted overnight, accompanied by nausea that Elliot dismissed as normal adjustment. At base camp, the symptoms resolved and Elliot's confidence rebounded. Kancha remained uncertain. The summit push began July 31st. The climb to Camp 2 went smoothly, but on the ascent to Camp 3, the headache returned within 2 hours. Elliot treated it with ibuprofen and mentioned it to Kancha as minor discomfort. Kancha asked directly about nausea, dizziness, and visual disturbance. Elliot denied all three. And this is the part that frustrated me most putting this together. A Sherpa with 4 26,000-foot summits is asking the exact right diagnostic questions, and the client looks him in the face and lies. At Camp 3, another climber observed Elliot stumbling between tents, brief, easily dismissed as exhaustion, but consistent with ataxia, the loss of coordination indicating the brain was beginning to swell. The climber mentioned it to Kancha, who confronted Elliot directly. Elliot insisted he was fine. Tired, yes. Headache, mild, but fine. He demonstrated coordination with exaggerated care that suggested he knew he was being evaluated. Kancha recommended descending to Camp 2. Elliot refused, arguing every climber felt terrible at 24,000 feet. The expedition leader, who had limited medical training, deferred to Elliot's self-assessment on the basis that the climber was verbal, ambulatory, and making clear decisions. They departed Camp 3 at 4 a.m. on August 2nd. Within 45 minutes, Elliot's pace had dropped to half the group average. He stopped frequently, leaning on his ice axe, each rest longer than the last. At approximately 24,800 feet, less than 200 vertical feet below Camp 4, Elliot sat down and did not get up. His speech was slurred, responses delayed by seconds. When Kancha asked him to touch his nose, his hand wavered and missed by inches. HACE had progressed past the point where descent alone might reverse it. I've read enough about cerebral edema to know that by the time someone can't touch their own nose, the window is almost closed. Elliot had been walking past that window for days. Kancha radioed Camp 4 and began moving Elliot downward, but Elliot resisted with the irrational combativeness characteristic of advanced cerebral edema, his swelling brain no longer producing coherent thought. 2 additional Sherpas arrived within 30 minutes. Together, they moved him roughly 400 feet before his body stopped cooperating entirely. He lost consciousness at 7:30 a.m., breathing falling into the irregular Cheney-Stokes pattern that indicated severe neurological failure. Elliot Marsh never regained consciousness. Dexamethasone was administered, but could not reverse days of accumulated damage. He died at approximately 2:15 p.m. on August 2nd, 2014. He was 28 years old. Kanchanuru sustained a severe lumbar strain from the hours carrying Elliot across steep terrain. The injury never fully resolved. He attempted one more expedition the following year and was forced to turn back when the pain made load carrying impossible. He retired from high-altitude work at 34 years old, career finished, because he spent hours hauling a man down a mountain who had no business being on it in the first place. That math never balances. Every warning had been given. Every signal the human body produces to say it is failing was present. None of it mattered, because the person receiving the warnings had already decided they did not apply to him. It was April 19th, 2017, and the air at Everest Base Camp carried the metallic edge of snow that had melted and refrozen overnight. The temperature sat around 24 degrees Fahrenheit, with gusts pushing through the Khumbu Glacier, strong enough to rattle tent poles and send loose equipment skidding across ice. Prayer flags strung between expedition clusters snapped in bursts, their frayed edges worn thin by seasons of wind and ultraviolet light. The camp was deep into its rhythm. Teams had been on the mountain for weeks, and the Icefall doctors had established and maintained the route through the Khumbu since early April. Lauren Shale arrived 3 weeks late. She was 41 years old, a corporate consultant from Denver who had rebranded herself as an adventure athlete after guided trips up Kilimanjaro and a partial ascent of Elbrus. 2 expedition companies had rejected her Everest application for insufficient experience. A third, a budget operator in Kathmandu with a reputation for flexibility, declined at first, but reversed the decision after Lauren wired an additional payment to the owner's personal account. The operator reassigned an unused permit from a canceled client and added Lauren to the roster mid-season. The field team was never told. When Lauren showed up at base camp, the expedition leader didn't recognize her. The client manifest listed 7 climbers. Lauren made 8. She produced paperwork showing the Kathmandu office had added her, and a phone call to the operator produced vague confirmation. The money had already been accepted. Lakpa Rangdu, the expedition's lead Sherpa, 36 years old with 9 Everest summits, saw the problem right away. Oxygen allocations, tent assignments, food rations, and Sherpa pairings had all been calculated for 7. Adding an 8th without adjustments meant someone would come up short when it mattered. That's what gets me every time with these stories. The guy with 9 summits flags the problem on day 1, and the answer is basically, figure it out. The first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu icefall exposed Lauren completely. She clipped her ascender backward twice. She froze on a ladder crossing until a line of climbers stacked up behind her. Her crampon technique alternated between flat footing, where she should have been front pointing, and dragging her feet in ways that snagged the rope. Lakpa corrected her patiently at first, then firmly, then with visible concern. Other clients on the rotation started requesting different group assignments. Nobody wanted to be roped to someone who couldn't keep pace, and the resentment was building quietly across the team. When Lakpa brought it to the expedition leader, Lauren was standing right there and jumped in, insisting her performance was normal for a first rotation. She name-dropped routes in Patagonia and a winter Denali attempt. A client who had actually climbed the Patagonian route later told the guide team that Lauren's descriptions didn't match the terrain. And look, I've seen climbers stretch their resumes before. Everyone adds a little polish. But making up entire routes you've never set foot on while standing next to people who have, that's a different level. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet confirmed everything. Lauren stumbled on flat glacier terrain, burned through water at twice the rate of other clients, and needed rest stops that pushed the group 2 hours behind. The third rotation reached only 22,800 feet, well short of Camp 3 at 23,500. Lauren couldn't hold front point technique on steep ice. Lakpa had to physically guide her boots into placements. They turned back. Lauren had never acclimatized above 23,000 feet. When the summit window opened, the expedition leader barred Lauren from the push. Her response was controlled, but threatening. She would contact the Kathmandu operator, have the guide replaced, and pursue legal action for services not rendered. She appeared to accept the decision. She did not. Lauren tagged along with another team's rope line during the afternoon, pushed to the South Col. In the crowding and wind, Sherpas assumed she belonged to a neighboring expedition. That night, Lakpa found her on the fixed ropes at 27,000 feet, climbing alone in the dark with no Sherpa assigned. Base camp radioed to turn her around, but pulling someone off a fixed rope who won't cooperate at that altitude risks both lives. Lauren refused to go down. They found her body the following afternoon at around 27,800 feet, seated against a rock band above the balcony. Her oxygen mask hung around her neck. Her hands were bare. Her eyes were open. She had never acclimatized above 23,000 feet, and cerebral edema had done what it always does to unprepared bodies. She was 41 years old. The bare hands are the detail I keep coming back to. Severe haste destroys judgment so completely that climbers stop protecting themselves from the cold. The brain can't process danger anymore. She was freezing to death and didn't have the awareness left to care. The Kathmandu operator faced investigation. 2 legitimate clients on the expedition failed to summit because Lauren's presence had thrown off the rotation schedule and squeezed their acclimatization windows. It was October 31st, 2014, in Nepal's Khumbu region, when Reden Lugmao, 26, was working in expedition logistics for a Kathmandu-based adventure company, handling the kind of behind-the-scenes work that keeps Everest expeditions running, like permits, coordination, and last-minute supply fixes. He had trekking experience in the Himalaya, but no technical climbing background, and his role stayed strictly on the operational side of things. 3 days earlier, a permit error had been flagged for an active Everest team at base camp. A replacement satellite phone battery pack was also delayed in transit. Reden was assigned to deliver both items from Gorak Shep to base camp on what was considered a routine, short administrative run. He set out in clear weather that morning. The route across the Khumbu Glacier was easy to see, marked by small stone piles spread out across the flat ice. He was carrying some papers, the replacement gear, and a phone with offline maps. Since it was meant to be a quick round trip, he only had regular trekking clothes with him and no extra survival equipment. He reached Everest Base Camp mid-morning and completed the delivery without issue. Expedition staff confirmed receipt, and weather reports at the time indicated a stable return window. He left shortly afterward, retracing the same route back toward Gorak Shep. By late morning, a western disturbance arrived faster than forecast. Cloud cover thickened over the valley, wind increased, and snowfall began rapidly reducing visibility across the glacier. Within a short window, the cairn-marked route became indistinguishable from surrounding terrain. Reden attempted to navigate using his phone's GPS, but in whiteout conditions, the flat glacier offered no visual reference points. As he corrected his bearing, he gradually drifted off the main corridor into a lateral moraine zone, where snow-covered debris closely resembled the main route. When his phone battery died, he was left without electronic navigation. He continued on foot in deteriorating weather until he reached a large granite boulder partially embedded in the ice. It provided limited wind shelter, and he stopped there to wait for conditions to improve. The weather did not improve. As the wind and snowfall picked up, the clothes he was wearing, fine while he was moving, stopped being enough once he was standing still for too long. Heat started leaving his body faster than he could replace it, especially with the wind cutting through his layers. Over time, his body temperature kept dropping. As hypothermia set in, his thinking would have slowed down too, making it harder to judge what was happening around him, keep track of time, or even figure out which direction he needed to go. He remained at the boulder as conditions continued through the afternoon. Snow accumulated around him while he stayed seated in partial shelter, increasingly isolated, as visibility collapsed across the glacier. Search efforts began after he failed to return to Gorak Shep on schedule. When a brief weather window opened later that day, lodge operators alerted base camp, triggering a coordinated search along the expected return route. Despite multiple passes along the corridor and moraine zones near Gorak Shep, worsening whiteout conditions prevented visual confirmation of his position. Search operations were eventually suspended, and Reden Lugmao was officially declared missing on the Khumbu Glacier. No recovery was achieved in 2014 or the following seasons. Raiden was officially declared missing after the failed search window closed, and the case was later classified as an unrecovered exposure incident on the Khumbu Glacier. The cause of death was recorded as accidental hypothermia. At the time, the case was treated as a navigation-related exposure fatality during a rapid weather shift. No single point of operational failure was identified beyond forecast limitations and loss of visibility on the glacier surface. In 2026, retreating ice along the lateral moraine corridor exposed a preserved body at the edge of a previously buried collapse zone. Identification matched Raiden Lugmao, with equipment still in place and a degraded personal device recovered alongside him. Despite damage, the device retained fragments of cached navigation data confirming his final drift off the main route during the 2014 whiteout. But when investigators reconstructed the final hours using that data, something didn't line up with the original conclusion about how he actually ended up there. The 2026 recovery changed how the whole case was understood. What was once written off as a straightforward exposure death started to look like part of a bigger pattern linked to melting glacier edges, where people caught in sudden weather shifts weren't just lost, but sometimes stayed preserved in places that had been buried or unreachable for years, only becoming visible again once the ice finally pulled back. Raiden Lugmao was one of several dozen recoveries documented during the 2026 Khumbu survey season. His case added to a growing record of exposure-related deaths concentrated along routine trekking corridors where navigation systems, weather volatility, and terrain uniformity created conditions for silent disappearance. The glacier had not erased him. It had held him in place until it no longer could. So, it was March 3rd, 2026. And the pre-dawn darkness above Camp 4 on the South Col was filled with headlamps, dozens of them, stretching up the triangular face toward the balcony in an unbroken chain of light. It was the first summit push of a season that had already broken records before a single climber touched the top. The Nepalese government had issued over 470 permits for the spring, surpassing the previous high by more than 50. From the research I did, apparently more operators had registered than any prior year, including a wave of budget companies offering packages at a fraction of established rates. When I discovered this, I already had a strange feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. Teams had arrived weeks ahead of schedule, driven by competition and the pressure to get clients acclimatized before the summit windows opened. Base camp on the Khumbu Glacier was packed. Expedition leaders studied the same weather models, circled the same dates, and planned to send clients up the same fixed ropes on the same days. The route had not changed. The bottleneck at the Hillary Step had not widened, but the number of people being funneled toward those choke points had exploded, and weather windows that allowed safe passage lasted only 2 or 3 days. The math was unsustainable, and over the next several weeks, these 5 cases I'm about to show you would prove it. And trust me, each one is worse than the last. Among the climbers departing Camp 4 that morning was Peter Van Hees, a 47-year-old Belgian who had spent most of his career in pharmaceutical sales, and the last 4 years redefining himself through mountaineering. He had summited Kilimanjaro and Elbrus on guided trips and considered Everest the natural next step. He signed with a budget operator in Kathmandu for roughly $35,000, well below established rates. The savings came from somewhere: fewer support staff, less oxygen margin, and an expedition structure built to move clients through the system rather than evaluate whether they belonged in it. His Sherpa was Jangbu Norkong, early 30s, 4 Everest summits. Quiet, reliable, the kind of guide who said little but missed nothing. He had noticed the size of the departing group that night. More headlamps than he had seen on any previous summit push. More bodies on the same fixed ropes. More oxygen being consumed in the same narrow corridor above 26,000 feet. The same silent but deadly killers I and regular viewers of this channel know all too well. Peter moved well through the early hours. His pace was steady, his crampon placements adequate on the hard snow of the triangular face. The trouble began above the balcony at 27,600 feet, where the route narrowed and the line of climbers ahead slowed to a crawl. A bottleneck had formed near the south summit, teams queuing on a narrow section of fixed rope where only one climber could move at a time. And if you've watched my other videos on overcrowding and bottlenecks, you already know what kind of brutal incidents it could cause. The line stopped and Peter stood still for over an hour. The wind chill was approximately minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and his oxygen hissed steadily through the regulator at a rate that did not care whether he was climbing or standing. Jiang Bu watched the gauge and ran the math. At current burn, they did not have enough to summit and return safely. He recommended they turn around. Peter refused. He had spent his savings on this expedition. He had told his colleagues, his family, his friends, he would conquer Everest at all costs, a seemingly common situation I've showcased on this channel plenty of times. Turning around was not something he had prepared for, and at 27,600 feet, the idea of descending felt worse than the risk of continuing. Jiang Bu repeated the recommendation. Peter pushed forward when the line moved. He reached the summit late in the morning, hours behind schedule. He spent less than 10 minutes before beginning his descent. His oxygen dropped to critical levels near the south summit. His coordination failed. Steps that had been deliberate became clumsy. Crampon points scraping rather than biting. He sat down on the fixed ropes at approximately 28,600 feet and did not stand again. Jiang Bu reached him within seconds but could not move him alone. Other descending climbers passed without stopping. They had their own oxygen running to zero. Peter Van Hes was found dead the following morning in the same seated position with his bottle empty. Honestly, I get it. It is their choice, and it admittedly might seem like a stupid decision to go mountain climbing, especially taking on Everest. But I can't help but feel sad every time I cover a story like this, even if they were at fault. His expedition company attributed the death to altitude sickness. Teams on the mountain that day knew the real cause: an hour-long traffic jam in the death zone that drained his only margin for survival. It was September 19th, 2013, and Cho Oyu's advanced base camp sat at 18,400 feet on the Tibetan Plateau. Tents arranged across gravel flats with views toward the mountain's north face. Prayer flags stretched between camp structures, and the thin air carried the smell of yak dung fires from nomad encampments below. Marcus Lane, 42, from Seattle, and his climbing partner Ben Whitfield, 34, from Portland, had been friends since college and expedition partners for 6 years. Cho Oyu was their first attempt at true extreme altitude. Both had secured sponsorships from the same outdoor apparel company, $8,000 each in exchange for branded content. The arrangement had been collaborative until the sponsor informed both men that only one would receive a renewed contract for next season, based on whose content performed better. The announcement transformed their partnership into a competition, neither acknowledged openly. Karma Chiring, 37, from Solukhumbu, was contracted to provide high-altitude support for both climbers at a rate of $5,500 plus a $2,500 summit bonus. His family owned a small tea house on the Everest Base Camp Trail, and the expedition payment would fund repairs before the next trekking season. The summit push departed Camp 3 at 24,300 feet on October the 7th under clear skies. Marcus, Ben, and Karma climbed together on snow slopes leading toward the summit ridge. By 26,000 feet, Ben was moving noticeably faster, his acclimatization slightly better, the difference now visible. He pulled ahead by 50 yards, then 100. Marcus watched the gap widen and felt the sponsorship slipping away. At approximately 26,400 feet, Marcus stopped and called out to Karma. He told him he was feeling dizzy and needed assistance immediately. Karma descended and assessed him. Oxygen saturation, 71%, consistent with what both climbers had been showing at similar altitudes. Pupils reactive, speech clear, balance steady. Karma saw no signs of edema or acute distress, but Marcus insisted his symptoms were worsening. The request forced a choice that commercial guiding ethics made nearly impossible to refuse. A client reporting symptoms at 26,400 feet required attention, regardless of whether the guide's assessment agreed. Leaving a reportedly symptomatic client could constitute negligence. Karma stayed with Marcus. Ben continued alone. What Marcus had calculated was that Ben would now be without Sherpa support on the upper mountain. The summit ridge wasn't technically dangerous in good conditions, but the final section included a steep face where a fixed rope had been partially buried by a recent snowfall. Climbers with Sherpa support were guided around the burial point. Climbers without guidance followed the visible rope until it disappeared and had to navigate the gap alone. Ben summited at 10:40 a.m. and spent 20 minutes filming content. He began descending at 11. At approximately 26,600 feet, he reached the buried section, probed the snow with his ice axe, and stepped onto what appeared to be consolidated surface. It collapsed beneath him, an undercut wind feature where snow had deposited over empty air, creating a false floor above a steep, walled depression in the ridge. Ben fell through the crust and tumbled down the concavity, his ice axe ripping from his hand. He slid roughly 25 feet before catching against exposed rock at the base. The fall broke his left leg below the knee, a compound fracture where the tibia punched through his gaiter. His right wrist shattered on impact. He came to rest fully conscious, staring up at the hole, aware he could not climb out. Marcus and Karma reached his position 30 minutes later. Karma assessed immediately. Ben was injured, immobile, losing blood from the compound fracture. He radioed Camp 3 and began rigging an anchor. Marcus stood at the edge and looked down at his climbing partner. He had his camera in his hand. He filmed the scene for 11 seconds before Karma told him to put it away and help with the rope. The rescue took 3 hours. Karma descended alone, splinted Ben's leg with an ice axe, shaft, and webbing, and rigged a hauling line. Once on the surface, the descent became a slow process of lowering a man with a compound fracture down 2,000 vertical feet, while managing shock, blood loss, and the altitude that turned every medical problem into a cascading crisis. The compound fracture bled steadily, blood soaking through the splint and freezing against his leg. His core temperature dropped, as shock redirected circulation away from extremities. By Camp 3, his skin had gone gray and his pulse was threading. Ben Whitfield died at Camp 3 at approximately 7 p.m. on October the 7th, 2013. He was 34 years old. The compound fracture had bled steadily through the descent, and the altitude had prevented his body from mounting the clotting response that might have saved him at lower elevation. Marcus descended to base camp the following morning. He posted a tribute to Ben that evening. Emotional, carefully worded, viewed by 40,000 people within a week. He did not mention the faked symptoms that had separated Ben from Sherpa support. Karma told the expedition leader what had happened. His account was corroborated by oxygen saturation logs and GPS tracking data, showing Marcus had stopped climbing at a point where no medical event was recorded. The sponsor terminated Marcus's contract. The guiding company blacklisted him from future expeditions. Karma continued guiding, but colleagues noticed he had become quieter, slower to trust, and unwilling to separate from clients under any circumstances. The custody filing landed in an Arizona courtroom in January of 2016. Warren Kessler, 46, a real estate developer out of Scottsdale, was fighting for primary custody of his 16-year-old son, Liam. His ex-wife's lawyers had built a portrait of an absent father, a man who always looked more comfortable closing deals than showing up to school events. Warren thought Everest would shut all of that down. He wasn't planning to wave it around in court or anything, but it's the kind of thing that's pretty hard to argue against. A father-son summit of the highest mountain on Earth, a mountain that, despite being one of the highest peaks already, continues to grow about 4 millimeters higher every year. Warren definitely had the money. That was never the problem. 20 years in commercial real estate meant $90,000 for an expedition barely registered. What he didn't have was a willing son. Liam was 16, one of the youngest climbers on the permit, and he told his mother before Nepal that he didn't want to go. Warren found out through his lawyer and turned it into a parental alienation claim. That came up early in my research, and it set the tone for everything. The kid said he didn't want to climb, and his dad used it against her in court. Liam wasn't the anxious type. He was just kinda more absent. He'd climbed Rainier and Elbrus with guides, and the feedback both times was basically identical. The kid never asked a single question about where they were going or what conditions looked like. From what it looks like, he just followed along, and that was it. On Elbrus, his guide noted that Liam ate every meal alone, just watching videos on his phone, rather than joining the group. Though honestly, he didn't seem antisocial. His mind was just somewhere else. The expedition company assigned Nima Wangdi to Liam specifically. Nima was 41, with 9 Everest summits behind him. The kind of Sherpa who could read a client's headspace from the way they adjusted a strap. He saw the problem inside the first week. During rotations up to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, Liam moved when told, stopped when told, ate when told. Never once checked his own gear. Nima brought this to the expedition leader. The leader brought it to Warren, and Warren apparently responded and said that the kid was just low-key and it was nothing to worry about. Then came the phone call. Rest day at Camp 2, May 2016. Warren rang his lawyer on the sat phone, not realizing how thin the mess tent walls were, so half the camp ended up hearing everything. Court date moved up. Needs summit photos before June. And after that call, you could just tell something shifted in him. Like the climb wasn't really a climb anymore. It was just a deadline with snow on it. On May 17th, summit night, they left the South Col at around 11:45 p.m. and fell into the line of headlamps heading up the mountain. -20 Fahrenheit, wind ripping sideways across the slopes. Liam kept pace through the lower sections. Same mechanical obedience as every rotation before. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, something had definitely switched off. If you didn't know, the balcony is basically a small flat area on the southeast ridge where climbers swap oxygen bottles and take stock of their condition. At that altitude, you're breathing air with roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. His pace dropped by half. It wasn't full haste, not yet, but the combination of hypoxia and whatever was happening in his head had thinned his cognition to almost nothing. He was still walking on his own, still clipping in and out, but his eyes were dead flat. You could tell he stopped being present in any way that mattered. Other climbers passing them on the fixed ropes later said it looked like he was sleepwalking. Nima told Warren to turn the team around. Warren refused. When Nima keyed his handset to radio the expedition leader, there was a long pause. The leader asked about Liam's vitals, asked whether he was showing physical symptoms. Warren took the handset and told the leader his son was fine, just tired. The leader told Nima to prioritize the turnaround time and use his judgment if things deteriorated, but stopped short of ordering them down. That's the part of these stories that sits with me the worst. The guide has the training, the experience, the judgment, and the system is built so that none of that matters when the money talks louder. They hit the summit at 11:20 a.m., and Liam was barely even there at that point. Warren spent like 20 minutes taking photos from every angle, holding up some banner his lawyer had apparently suggested, and Nima kept telling him they needed to go down, but Warren just kept messing with the camera, and honestly, that part just frustrated me to no end. The descent fell apart fast. Liam couldn't coordinate his crampons on the down climbing. Every step required Nima to physically position his feet and wait while Liam processed instructions with a delay that stretched longer each time, and other teams passed them going down. Nobody stopped beyond a glance. It isn't out of cruelty, but at that altitude, you don't stop for someone else's problem unless you want to become part of it. Oxygen ran low for both Kesslers. Nima started switching Liam onto his own oxygen supply intermittently, sharing his mask in controlled intervals. Every swap meant pulling mitts off with bare fingers to manage the connection, and each time he exposed his hands, the frostbite risk climbed. Bare skin at -20 Fahrenheit with wind can develop frostbite in under 5 minutes. Nima was doing this repeatedly over the course of hours. 3 people, not enough oxygen for 2, descending at a pace that would put them on the upper mountain after dark. Warren was the first to go down. The signs had been building for a while. Bad coordination, slow responses, none of his decisions making any sense. Basically textbook haste creeping in. By the time they were above the south summit around 28,500 feet, it had gotten bad. He sat down in the snow and that was it, and Liam just stopped right next to him. That part honestly broke me a little because the kid had been operating on his father's commands the whole expedition, and the second those commands stopped, he just shut down too. Not because his body failed, but because no one ever taught him that his own decisions were worth anything. Nima couldn't move both of them. There was just no way at that altitude. He stayed as long as he could until his own oxygen was basically gone, and then had to descend alone. He made it back to Camp 4 after dark, both hands badly frostbitten from having to pull his outer mitts off over and over to manage equipment during those last hours. Neither Warren nor Liam was seen alive again. Their location on the upper mountain was documented, but recovery was deemed too dangerous. They remain on Everest. Nima lost 3 fingers. His career on the high mountains was finished. The custody case was formally dismissed after both were declared deceased. Liam's mother told a reporter months later that she'd spent the whole spring trying to stop it through channels that moved too slowly. It was July 18th, 2016, and the morning briefing at K2 Base Camp carried the restless energy of a season approaching its climax. Forecasters predicted a 3-day window beginning July 20th, the best opportunity all season. Teams began final preparations, checking oxygen systems and inventorying supplies at higher camps. Nathan Crowell was 35, a wilderness guide from Montana who had summited Denali 3 times and completed Manaslu the previous year. His experience was legitimate. What was not legitimate was his oxygen plan, and I want to be clear here. Nathan wasn't a fraud or a beginner. He was someone who genuinely belonged on K2 and still made a calculation that killed him, which in some ways makes this one harder to process. Nathan had chosen a Pakistani operator whose fee was roughly 40% below the major companies. The savings came from reduced staffing, fewer oxygen bottles, and minimal contingency supplies. The operator supplied smaller, lighter cylinders than the standard Poisk bottles, each lasting roughly 5 hours at a full flow rate of 2 liters per minute. Nathan carried 3 for summit day, planning to conserve on the lower sections at 1.5 liters per minute and switch to full flow above the bottleneck. By his calculation, 2 bottles would cover the ascent and 1 would carry him back down. The standard recommendation was 4 to 5 bottles, accounting for delays and the universal truth that summit days always took longer than planned. Chiwang Landu, Nathan's lead Sherpa, raised the issue before the push began. Chiwang was 39, a veteran of 8 26,000-foot summits who had survived a Serac collapse on Annapurna that killed 2 teammates. 3 undersized bottles on K2 set off every alarm in his judgment. He recommended caching a 4th at the top of the bottleneck for descent. Nathan declined. The extra weight would slow his ascent, and his consumption rate on the lower mountain had proven he could stretch the supply. They departed Camp 4 at 10:30 p.m. on July 20th. The night was cold and clear, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. Nathan moved efficiently through the darkness, passed through the bottleneck without incident, the hanging Serac visible above as a dark mass against the stars, and continued on to the upper slopes as dawn broke across the Karakoram. The summit push took longer than his schedule allowed. Traffic on the upper traverse forced repeated stops, and the final pyramid demanded sustained effort on mixed rock and ice that burned through oxygen faster than the reduced flow could sustain. He switched to full flow well before planned, chewing through his 2nd bottle and dipping into his 3rd before reaching the top. Nathan reached the summit at 1:45 p.m., over an hour behind schedule. He had 1 bottle remaining, already partially depleted. His entire descent supply amounted to roughly 4.5 hours at full flow. The descent would take at least 5. The math worked only if everything went perfectly. Nothing went perfectly. When I first worked through the oxygen numbers for this story, I kept rechecking them because I couldn't believe someone with his experience would cut it that close. The margin he thought he had never existed. The descent was slower than the ascent. Depleted legs responded sluggishly. Traffic from late summiting climbers forced delays on narrow sections. Nathan's bottle emptied at approximately 6:20 p.m. He was at roughly 27,000 feet, still above the bottleneck, with at least 3 hours of descent remaining. Within 15 minutes, his pace dropped visibly. Within 30, his breathing had become the rapid, shallow gasping of a body unable to extract oxygen from air that contained almost none. Chiwang offered his own remaining supply. Nathan accepted, but the interruption had triggered deterioration that a partial bottle could not reverse. They entered the bottleneck at 7:10 p.m. in failing light. Nathan's movements had become mechanical, clipping and unclipping with fumbling hands, each transition requiring multiple attempts. At approximately 7:45 p.m., his legs stopped functioning. He sat on the slope and could not stand. The remaining oxygen ran dry. At 26,500 feet in the bottleneck, in the dark, without oxygen, with a body pushed beyond capacity for nearly 22 hours, Nathan had reached the end of what willpower could sustain. Chiwang stayed for over an hour, attempting to revive him, to motivate movement. The responses diminished, slurred words to sounds to silence. When Nathan stopped responding entirely, Chiwang descended alone, reaching Camp 4 at 11 p.m. I spent a long time thinking about that hour Chiwang sat with him, knowing exactly what was happening, unable to change it, choosing to stay anyway. That kind of loyalty doesn't get written about enough. Nathan Crowell was found the following morning, seated on the slope, attached to the fixed rope. He was 35. Chiwang Landu completed the season and returned to Nepal. He did not accept contracts the following year or the year after. He told colleagues he had spent 15 years watching clients make decisions that killed them, and Nathan had been the last one he was willing to carry. Every bottle counted. Every hour mattered. Every calculation that ignored margins was a gamble placed against a mountain that never lost. It was April 22nd, 2018, and the trail above La Bouche wound through terrain dotted with memorial cairns, stone pyramids for climbers who never came back. The air at 16,000 feet made conversation tough on the uphills. and the afternoon clouds rolling up the valley brought a damp cold that got into your clothing and stayed. Paige Dunnigan was 52, a petroleum executive from Houston, and she moved slowly at the back of her group. Tall and solid, she carried herself like someone used to. Authority, but altitude was stripping that away. Her breathing ran heavier than the other clients. Her rest stops came more often, and her complexion had a grayish tone that her climbing Sherpa picked up on before anyone else. Furba Concha was 29 with 4 summits, young for that number. He'd grown up in Rolwaling and finished a high-altitude medicine program run by a climbing NGO. The training taught him to read signs that most Sherpas picked up through instinct rather than clinical knowledge. He watched Paige closely from day one. Paige's medical clearance was forged. 2 years earlier, she'd had angioplasty. She was on daily cardiac medication. She had paid a cardiologist in Houston to sign a letter certifying her fit for extreme altitude with no issues. Furba noticed the pills first. Every morning, taken in secret from unmarked bottles. On the first rotation, Paige's oxygen saturation dropped lower and bounced back slower than it should have. Her lips went bluish at 19,500 feet. On the second rotation to Camp 2, Furba picked up an irregular pulse, racing, then pausing, then racing again. He reported it. Paige pulled out the cardiologist's letter. The expedition doctor went with the paperwork. Paige found out Furba had raised concerns. She told Furba, right there in front of other Sherpas, that if Furba's interference cost her the summit, she'd make sure Furba never worked for the company again. Paige had connections to the expedition's investors. That kind of threat carried real weight in a community where seasonal work decided whether families got through the winter. This part is hard for me to talk about calmly because the power dynamics are so ugly. A 29-year-old Sherpa catches a legitimate medical red flag, reports it like he's trained to, and gets threatened with career destruction by the patient. And the system lets it happen because Paige has paperwork and connections. Furba stopped filing formal reports. He didn't stop watching. During the third rotation, he saw Paige palming white tablets under her tongue. Nitroglycerin for acute cardiac relief. Summit push, May 20th. Paige got to Camp 4, gray-faced, breathing hard even on supplemental oxygen. They left at midnight. She climbed slowly but steadily, reaching the balcony at 27,600 feet, nearly an hour behind the group. Above that, her pace fell off even more. Each step took visible seconds of effort. At around 28,100 feet, Paige pressed her hand to her chest. She doubled over her ice axe. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She collapsed onto the fixed rope. The cardiac condition her forged documents had hidden finally met the altitude, cold, and exertion it needed. Furba went through Paige's pack looking for emergency meds and found everything the clearance letter denied: beta blockers, nitroglycerin, aspirin, a pulse oximeter, a full cardiac pharmacy, 28,000 feet. She carried the evidence of her own lie the entire climb and still handed over that forged clearance. I genuinely don't know what to do with that level of denial. Furba attempted chest compressions at 28,000 feet in the dark on a steep slope. The altitude made it nearly impossible. He managed less than a minute before exhaustion, and the lack of any response made the outcome clear. Paige Dunnigan was 52. The investigation pulled Paige's full medical records. The physician in Houston lost his license. Furba Concha finished the season but never went back to high-altitude work. He told friends what happened at 28,000 feet changed something in him that didn't come back. I want to take a second here because I sometimes get asked why I keep making these videos. It's not about just being a source of income, and honestly, the answer changes depending on the week. Sometimes it's because the stories genuinely keep me up at night, and making the video is the only way I can get them out of my head. Other times it's because I read the comments and realize people actually learn from this stuff. But if I'm being really honest, the main reason is the Sherpas. Their side almost never gets told, and I think that matters more than any of us realize. It was September 9th, 2013, in Nepal's Khumbu region during this post-monsoon period when conditions were especially unstable. And Dr. Marlon Elroy, 51, a glaciologist from a U.S. university studying slow glacier loss and hidden melt beneath the surface, led a National Science Foundation-funded team out onto the Khumbu Glacier with 2 graduate students and a Nepali field assistant to install monitoring equipment across the ice. The team established camp near Gorak Shep and moved onto the glacier during stable morning conditions to begin sensor installation along the medial moraine, a debris ridge formed by rock deposited over ice flows that often appears stable despite internal melting beneath it. Their mapping data, based on earlier satellite imagery, did not reflect recent 2-year changes in glacier geometry particularly along the eastern moraine edge where subsurface cavities had expanded. At the site, Marlin stayed mostly focused on getting the sensors placed correctly, while the rest of the team split up, some drilling anchor points into the ice and rock, others recording data and handling equipment on the more stable western side. Later on, he moved toward the eastern side of the moraine to check another sensor location, not realizing that the area had been slowly hollowed out underneath by melting ice. From the surface, nothing really looked wrong or unstable, so there were no clear warning signs that the ground below had already weakened. Marlin tested the surface with a trekking pole before stepping forward, receiving resistance that suggested stability in the compacted debris layer. While field-proven as a cautious method, this test could not account for voids beneath thin crusts of sediment and ice that often form in moraine systems during peak melt cycles. The surface appeared continuous, with no obvious sign of structural separation. Shortly afterward, a minor equipment issue drew attention from another team member, and Marlin briefly stepped back before pausing near a faint linear crack in the debris surface. The feature was subtle and could represent either harmless settling or deeper structural separation, a distinction that often requires subsurface imaging to confirm in glacial terrain. Moments later, a deep, hollow subsurface sound was heard, indicating internal failure beneath the moraine. A section of the eastern edge, approximately 24 feet across, collapsed into a melt cavity that had formed and expanded beneath the debris layer over time. The collapse was driven not by surface force but by loss of internal support as ice and sediment bridging the void gave way. Marlin fell approximately 9 feet into the cavity as the surface layer fractured and dropped with him, partially burying him in a mix of rock, ice fragments, and saturated sediment. His upper body remained visible above the debris, and he was still moving when colleagues reached the edge within seconds of the collapse. The cavity itself was narrow and unstable, continuing to shed material after the initial failure. A radio call went out right away, and a rescue team was sent from base camp about 1.2 miles away. People on site kept watching him and stayed in contact while trying to hold the edges of the collapse area together as best they could. But the ground kept breaking down as they worked, with the ice and debris continuing to shift and weaken, which is common in late-season glacier conditions when everything is already starting to melt and lose stability. The rescue team arrived later that morning and attempted a staged extraction due to continued instability along the cavity walls. However, repeated secondary collapses along the moraine made sustained access impossible, and the structure continued to degrade while teams were on site. Marlin became separated from rescue access during repeated moraine collapses, and the cavity, fully destabilized before extraction, could be completed. Search operations were suspended due to continuing structural failure across the medial moraine, and no recovery was achieved at the time. He was officially declared missing later that day, with no recovery possible under the conditions. The collapse zone remained unstable and inaccessible in the days that followed, and no retrieval was achieved in 2013 or in subsequent seasons. In 2026, retreating glacier sections exposed the collapsed cavity zone, where researchers recovered Marlin Elroy's remains alongside the sensor array he had been installing at the time of the 2013 expedition, marking the first successful recovery since his disappearance. Recovered sensor data from Marlin's original installation, later processed by his research team, provided baseline measurements that allowed scientists to quantify the rate of subsurface cavity expansion over more than a decade. The recovered sensor data, still partially intact, allowed researchers to reconstruct long-term changes in the moraine's internal structure. His case became one of the early documented examples used to demonstrate how hidden subsurface melt can destabilize debris-covered glaciers over time, leaving collapse zones that remain active long after the surface appears stable. Late in the trekking season in the Khumbu, the path between Gorak Shep and Everest Base Camp starts to feel less predictable, not because it's closed, but because the weather turns faster and fewer people are out there to keep it active and familiar. It was March 14th, 2026. Every team that had not yet summited made their push on the same night. Among them was a commercial expedition led by a Nepali operator with a strong reputation. Their lead Sherpa was Furba Thendup, late 30s, 9 Everest summits, one of the most respected high-altitude guides in the Khumbu. He had spent 15 years on the mountain and had never lost a client. His team included 5 clients. One was Alison Brewer, 37, a Canadian nurse from Calgary who had trained for 3 years and saved for 5. She was competent, strong cardiovascular fitness, solid acclimatization, No signs of altitude illness. Not elite, but not unqualified. She had come to Everest knowing the risks and accepting them, something that I can wholeheartedly respect. Furba stood outside his tent on the South Col and counted headlamps on the route above. He stopped counting after 150. He had never seen anything like it. He radioed his expedition leader and recommended delaying departure by 2 hours to let the worst traffic pass, and the leader agreed. From what I can find, the delay placed them behind the main crowd, but did not solve the problem. The bottleneck was above them, not behind. By the time Furba's team reached the balcony at dawn, the line above was barely moving. Climbers were visible in an unbroken chain all the way to the south summit. 100 bodies on fixed ropes, each one consuming oxygen, calculated for movement, not standstill. Above the south summit, the line at the Hillary Step had ground to a complete halt. Climbers stacked on the narrow ridge, exposed to wind, unable to move forward, unable to easily retreat. Furba's team reached the queue and stopped. They stood still for over 2 hours at approximately 28,600 feet. 2 hours of burning oxygen. 2 hours of heat bleeding from their bodies into wind that carried it away faster than their metabolisms could replace it. Furba watched his clients. 2 were deteriorating visibly. One swaying on his feet, the other had stopped responding to questions. And honestly, just imagining even being in the Sherpa's situation shakes me to my core. Allison was holding steady, but her oxygen gauge was dropping faster than the timeline allowed. Furba radioed the expedition leader and recommended turning the entire team around immediately. The leader hesitated. Clients had paid. Clients were begging to continue. The summit was visible above them. But Furba did not wait for the answer. He began turning the team around himself. And yeah, this really cements it for me, that Sherpas really are elite athletes, but are also one of the kindest people out there. But 2 hours of standing still at 28,600 feet had already caused damage that descent could not reverse. The 2 weakest clients began collapsing on the way down. The first stopped moving above the south summit and could not be revived. He died on the fixed ropes before the team had descended 500 feet. The second made it further, but lost consciousness below 28,000 feet. Sherpas from another expedition attempted to help, but there was nothing left to save. He died where he fell. Other climbers were also failing around them. The entire upper section of the mountain was becoming a slow-motion crisis. Fixed ropes were jammed with people trying to descend. Bodies were passed on the route. Climbers who had sat down and never stood again, their outlines already dusted with blown snow. Reading this part, where everything all around them was just in constant chaos, was so terrifying, I had to take a breather and stop for a second. I can only imagine what it's like when you're there in person. But Allison began deteriorating below the south summit. Her speech became confused, answers arriving seconds late and disconnected from the questions. Her steps turned mechanical, the movement of someone whose conscious mind was no longer fully directing her body. Furba stayed at her side, adjusting her oxygen, placing her feet, talking her down step by step through terrain that required constant focus. Her condition worsened with each 100 feet of descent. She began pulling at her gloves, tugging them off with a dull, repetitive insistence of someone whose brain was misfiring, interpreting the cold as heat, paradoxical undressing, a hallmark of terminal hypothermia and cerebral edema. Furba replaced them. She removed them again. Her oxygen ran out. Furba removed his own mask and fitted his bottle onto her regulator. She improved briefly. A few steps, a flicker of clarity that disappeared like a match struck in wind. She sat down on the fixed rope at approximately 27,200 feet and looked at Furba without recognition. Her eyes were open, but the person behind them had retreated somewhere the thin air could not reach. I thought he couldn't surprise me anymore, but then Furba lifted her over his shoulder and descended, carrying her weight without supplemental oxygen at an altitude where every breath delivered a fraction of what his cells required. He carried her for roughly 200 vertical feet before his legs gave out. His vision darkened. His lungs produced a wet, rattling sound with each breath that had not been there before. He lowered her to the ice and knelt beside her. She was no longer breathing. Furba Thendup stayed beside Allison Brewer on the fixed ropes until another Sherpa team found them and forced him to descend. He reached Camp 4 after dark, unable to speak, his breathing shallow and labored. And wow, that was one chaotic ride. Even just reading it, I honestly am just speechless. 7 climbers died that day across multiple expeditions. The 2026 season's death toll reached 18, the highest in years. Investigations were launched by Nepalese authorities. Permit reform was discussed publicly for the first time with genuine urgency. Expedition companies issued statements, but nothing was resolved. And honestly, this part was hard to write, and I'm happy Phirba Thendup survived. But examinations in Kathmandu revealed permanent lung damage from prolonged exposure above 27,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. Doctors told him he could not return to extreme altitude. After 9 summits and 15 years of guiding, his career was over, ended on a night when he gave his oxygen to a client the system had placed in a line that should never have existed. The mountain's appearance itself did not change in 2026. Everest is the same height it has always been. The same ice, the same ridges, the same thin air that has killed climbers for over a century. What changed was everything around it. More permits, more operators, more money, more clients who had no business being above 26,000 feet, and a route to the summit that could not expand to hold the demand being forced through it. The deaths that season were not caused by Everest. They were caused by what Everest had been turned into, an overcrowded funnel where one narrow weather window and one traffic jam could turn a summit push into a mass casualty event. It was July 8th, 2016, and K2's bottleneck stretched 600 vertical feet above Camp 4, a steep couloir of blue ice angled at 50 degrees and hemmed beneath a hanging serac that could collapse without warning. Dawn light filtered into the gully as climbers descended from the summit. Temperatures sat near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Rachel Winters, 34, from Sydney, had summited K2 4 hours earlier alongside Tom Clarkson, 41, from Vancouver, a climbing partnership that had survived 5 years of expeditions, but not the messy breakup 3 months before this climb. Both were experienced on technical peaks, and both had insisted they could remain professional despite personal history. Mingma Bote, 38, from Fortsay, was Rachel's assigned Sherpa with 3 K2 summits across 9 seasons, an exceptional record on a mountain where most veteran guides counted 1 or 2 ascents as a career's worth. His wife ran a small guest house in Namche Bazaar, and his 3 children attended boarding school in Kathmandu. The descent had been manageable until Tom's crampon caught on buried rock near an anchor point. He stumbled sideways, slammed into the ice wall with his shoulder leading, and felt the joint dislocate with immediate, nauseating pain. His right arm went useless, his breathing shallow as shock set in. Mingma clipped into the anchor above and assessed the injury. Tom could not use his Jumar, could not brake during rappels, could not self-arrest. Descending the remaining 10,000 vertical feet would require Mingma to manage every transition while keeping Tom upright and attached. Rachel had continued descending during the initial assessment. When she realized what had happened, she climbed back up and listened while Mingma explained the situation. Her response focused on risk rather than partnership. Staying in the bottleneck increased exposure to the serac and burned time they needed for safer altitude. Mingma countered that Tom could not descend alone. Rachel's position was that Mingma was being paid to guide her, not Tom. She took the spare oxygen bottle, the emergency bivouac sack, and the first aid pouch from Mingma's pack and continued descending alone. What followed was 6 hours of exhausting technical work. Mingma lowered Tom through sections too steep to descend normally, rigged anchors at every opportunity, and physically supported Tom's weight during traverses where balance was critical. Other descending climbers passed with brief expressions of concern, but no offers of help. By late afternoon, Tom had stopped responding. His core temperature was dropping, his speech dissolved into fragments, his legs bearing no weight. At approximately 6 p.m., still 800 vertical feet above Camp 4, Tom lost consciousness. Mingma anchored him to the fixed line and checked for a pulse. Faint, irregular, but present. He radioed Camp 4 and was told a rescue team would come at first light. The serac overhead made nighttime movement suicidal. Mingma stayed clipped beside Tom through the night. Temperatures dropped past minus 40. He shared his remaining oxygen, alternating the mask between them in intervals that kept neither adequately supplied. Sometime before dawn, Tom's breathing stopped. Mingma checked the pulse at his neck and found nothing. He continued holding the mask against Tom's face for several minutes before accepting what the mountain had decided. Tom Clarkson died on K2's bottleneck at approximately 26,400 feet. He was 41 years old. The rescue team found Mingma at first light, hypothermic, severely dehydrated, unable to stand. Medical evaluation in Islamabad revealed acute kidney injury from rhabdomyolysis, severe enough to require dialysis. The damage ended his ability to function at extreme altitude. He returned to Nepal, sold his family home share to cover medical expenses, and never guided above 20,000 feet again. Rachel defended her decision as consistent with mountaineering protocol. The climbing community quietly ensured she would not be welcomed on future Himalayan expeditions. Martin Freed heard the briefing and ignored the part that mattered. Martin was 52, tech money out of Austin, and he'd spent 2 years planning one specific moment, his son Aiden standing on top of Everest on May 19th, the kid's 18th birthday. He'd had a banner made, GoPros configured for the summit shot. The whole narrative was locked in. Aiden was the real climber in the family. 18. Denali and Aconcagua already behind him, strong on technical terrain, good instincts. He kept a detailed climbing journal and logged every training session for 2 years leading up to Everest. His gear was his own, bought with money he'd saved from part-time work, not his father's credit card. He told his father they should go when the window was open. Martin said no. The birthday was the point. This one hit differently for me than the others. Martin wasn't cruel. He wasn't selfish the way Warren Kessler was. He just loved his kid and wanted to give him something extraordinary. But Everest doesn't grade on intention. It grades on timing. Chairing Namgyal, their Sherpa, 33 with 5 summits, backed Aiden up through the expedition leader. Martin held firm. Most teams sent their climbers up on the 17th and 18th. By the evening of the 18th, the wind was already picking up and clouds were stacking to the west. Martin and Aiden left the South Col late on the 18th, aiming for a birthday summit. They pushed into conditions that were already worsening. Wind above the balcony built steadily through the night, gusting past 60 miles per hour by the time they reached 28,000 feet. For your context, sustained winds above 50 miles per hour on the upper mountain are considered enough to knock a grown adult off their feet, especially on exposed ridgelines where there's nothing to grab. Visibility was dropping and temperature was getting worse. They got to about 28,200 feet before cheering stopped them. Aiden agreed instantly. Martin pushed back 900 feet from the top. So close. Aiden stood his ground and said he was going down, with or without him. Martin, faced with his son descending alone, finally changed his mind. Coming down broke Martin. He slipped on a steep section below the balcony, fell about 15 feet before the fixed rope caught him, and the impact left him with a severe ankle fracture. At 27,000 feet in that wind, a broken ankle is a death sentence in slow motion. Cheering and Aiden got on either side of him and tried to bring him down, but they were losing daylight, losing warmth, and covering ground so slowly that the mountain was gaining on them. Martin died from exposure sometime in the early hours of May 19th. The cold took him the way it takes everyone at that altitude. Shivering that stops, confusion that deepens, a stillness that sets in and doesn't lift. His son's 18th birthday, Aiden and Cheering barely made it back to Camp 4 at dawn. Aiden lost several toes to frostbite. He went back to climbing 2 years later, but he's never gone near Everest. Cheering finished the season, then told his company he wouldn't take clients who overruled weather calls. They couldn't promise him that, so he walked away from high-altitude work entirely. It was March 8th, 2026, and the next summit window was building. At Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, climbers moved in slow lines up blue ice that held between 40 and 50 degrees. Among them, barely moving, requiring support from both sides, was Tariq al-Rashid. He was 54, Emirati, and the founder of a construction empire across the Gulf. He was not a climber, one guided trek in Nepal and a guided Kilimanjaro summit, both with full porter support, no technical skill required. He had never used crampons on steep ice or spent a night above 20,000 feet. What he had was money, and on Everest in 2026, that was increasingly the only qualification that mattered. And well, it might seem obvious, but believe me, from the stories I've covered and researched, money in climbing never ends well. He had hired a premium operator for well over $100,000, a dedicated 2 Sherpa team, and extra oxygen. He had been posting about the climb on social media for months. The narrative demanded a summit. His lead Sherpa was Thendu Galzin, early 40s, 8 Everest summits. His second was Furba Concha, late 20s, 2 summits, strong but less experienced with difficult clients. At Camp 3, Thendu radioed the expedition leader and recommended the client not continue. Too slow, too exhausted, too unskilled. The leader hesitated. Tariq had paid the highest fee of the season. He had connections that could generate future bookings. He had announced on social media he would summit within days. The leader overrode the recommendation, something that infuriated me to my core when I read it. They got Tariq to Camp 4. He could barely function, could not prepare equipment, struggled to eat. On summit night, the team departed over an hour late. They fell behind immediately. The ascent took more than 14 hours. Every step above 27,000 feet required rest. The Sherpas essentially guided his body upward, positioning his feet, adjusting his ascender, managing his oxygen, carrying everything he could not. They reached the summit in the early afternoon, long after most teams had descended. The Sherpas were destroyed, and I actually shed a tear when I read this, especially knowing what happens next. Most of the Sherpas I've read up on are truly kind and have the client's best interest in mind. That's why this next part will be hard to read, but let's continue. On descent, Tariq's legs gave out above the balcony. He sat down and could not stand. Thendu and Furba Kancha attempted to drag him down the fixed ropes, bearing his weight between them on terrain steep enough that a misstep could send all three falling. During the effort, Furba Kancha's knee buckled under the combined load on a section of hard ice, ligaments tearing. He collapsed beside the client he was trying to save. Tariq stopped responding, and his breathing became irregular, then shallow, then quiet. And then he died near the balcony in the early evening at approximately 27,500 feet. Thendu and the injured Furba Kancha descended to Camp 4 in darkness, one supporting the other on a leg that could no longer bear full weight. The expedition company stated that all safety protocols were followed. The Sherpa community knew otherwise. Furba Kancha's knee required surgery in Kathmandu. The damage ended his career at 28. He had been injured trying to save a man the system placed on Everest because of greed. And truthfully, being angry and sad is all I can do through a screen. But I'll never forget Furba's heroic act, and I hope you don't too. It was August 9th, 2015, and the route between Camp 2 and Camp 3 on K2 crossed some of the most avalanche-prone terrain on the mountain. The section between 22,000 and 23,500 feet traversed steep snow slopes where wind-deposited slabs lay over weaker layers, configurations that any avalanche forecaster would have flagged immediately. On K2, that assessment fell to climbers and Sherpas who read the snow through experience, intuition, and respect for what they could not see beneath the surface. Werner Steinbach was 47, an Austrian alpinist from Innsbruck with a resume stretching back 3 decades. He had climbed north faces in the Alps, established new routes in Patagonia, and summited 3 26,000-foot peaks in alpine style. Fast, light, no supplemental oxygen. He was skilled, experienced, and built his identity on doing things differently from commercial climbers he quietly disdained. He viewed fixed ropes as crutches, Sherpa support as a convenience that weakened the experience, and the commercialization of the Karakoram as something that degraded the mountains he had loved since his 20s. I'll say this, of the 5 people in this video, Werner is the only one I'd call a genuinely accomplished climber, and that makes what happened harder to dismiss, because this wasn't ignorance, was pride. He had joined a small independent expedition that shared logistics but climbed independently. His nearest Sherpa contact was Ngawang Tendi, 29, from the Rolwelling Valley, responsible for maintaining fixed ropes between camps. Ngawang was young but had 3 26,000-foot summits and a natural fluency on steep ice. He had been watching Werner's route choices with growing concern. On 2 previous acclimatization rotations, Werner had left the fixed rope route to climb adjacent terrain he considered more direct. Each time he moved through slopes the Sherpas had deliberately avoided due to avalanche risk. Each time, nothing happened, which Werner interpreted as validation and the Sherpas interpreted as luck. That distinction is everything. Same outcome. 2 completely different conclusions about what it meant. I've seen that pattern end one way every single time. On the evening of August 8th, Ngawang approached Werner at Camp 2 and described conditions above. Recent snowfall had deposited fresh slab over an older, weaker layer on the slopes flanking the fixed rope route. The standard path followed a rocky rib that provided natural protection. The couloir Werner had used previously was loaded and dangerous. Ngawang was specific. The couloir should not be entered until the snowpack had stabilized. Werner thanked him and said nothing about his plans. Other climbers noticed him studying the couloir through binoculars that evening. Werner departed Camp 2 at 5:30 a.m. on August 9th. Ngawang was already on the fixed rope route above, ferrying oxygen to Camp 3. At approximately 6:15 a.m., he saw a single figure leave the fixed route at 22,400 feet and traverse toward the couloir. The deliberate, efficient movement identified the climber as Werner. Ngawang radioed base camp. The response was immediate. Someone needed to contact Werner, but Werner was not carrying a radio. He climbed alone, as he preferred, with only the equipment he deemed essential. And this is the detail that still gets to me. He wasn't just ignoring a warning, he had made himself unreachable by design. The philosophy he was proudest of is the same thing that guaranteed no one could stop him. Werner entered the couloir at 6:30 a.m., ascending at a pace reflecting decades of alpine experience. The snow surface appeared firm. Every external sign suggested safe conditions. But the danger lay beneath. Faceted crystals formed during a cold period 2 weeks earlier, buried under 16 inches of wind-packed slab. At approximately 6:45 a.m., 300 feet up the couloir, the slab fractured. The crack shot outward from beneath his feet in both directions, splitting the snowpack along the buried weak layer. The slope began to move. Ngawang, watching from the fixed route, roughly 200 feet away, saw the fracture line appear. The avalanche was not enormous, a slab roughly 80 feet wide and 400 feet long, but it moved with force that made size irrelevant. Werner disappeared into the churning debris within seconds. The slide channeled into a narrowing section, accelerated over a rock band, and deposited everything 600 vertical feet below in a fan of compacted snow. A search team reached the debris within 90 minutes. They probed for 2 hours across snow that had set like concrete. Werner Steinbach was found 4 feet below the surface, with trauma consistent with impact against the rock band. He was 47 years old. Ngawang Tendi was physically unharmed. He had watched a man he warned walk into a slope he had specifically identified as dangerous, unable to do anything except observe the result. He completed the 2015 season, worked one more expedition on Manaslu the following spring, and then stopped. He told friends in Roll Whaling he was done watching people choose how they died. He was 29 when he retired from high-altitude work. 29. I keep coming back to that number. Most people are just getting started at 29, and Ngawang was already done, not from injury, but because he couldn't watch one more person die after being told exactly what would happen. 5 climbers, 5 warnings delivered clearly by people whose job it was to keep them alive. 5 decisions to ignore expertise in favor of confidence, ambition, or impatience. K2 did not punish them for being on the mountain. It punished them for believing they knew better than the people who understood it. And in every case, the cost extended beyond the person who made the choice, reaching into the lives of Sherpas who carried the weight of someone else's decisions long after the mountain had finished with them.